Welcome to Cozy Mystery Stories, where secrets simmer beneath the surface of polite society. Our tale unfolds on a bleak winter's evening in a seemingly tranquil Connecticut suburb. Here, among longtime neighbours gathered for a routine game of bridge, a lifetime of courtesies is about to unravel. For when the snow begins to fall, trapping them in a gilded cage of their own making, they will discover that the most dangerous deceptions are the ones played closest to home. The fire in the hemlocks, drawing room crackled with a cheerfulness that felt almost defiant against the wind, rattling the window panes. Outside, the world was rapidly dissolving into a maelstrom of white, the sort of blizzard that New Englanders speak of for years to come. Inside, however, civilization held sway. Crystal glasses tinkled, the aroma of Beatrice Hemlock's mulled cider hung in the air, and the gentle slap of playing cards on felt-topped tables provided a soothing rhythm to the evening. Ah, but my dear reader, the truth is often disguised in the ordinary, and the most placid surfaces can conceal the most turbulent depths. This was, after all, the weekly bridge party, a sacrosanct ritual in the manicured enclave of Greenfield Hills. The players were always the same, a constellation of familiar faces orbiting the twin sons of Arthur and Beatrice Hemlock. Arthur, a man whose retirement from finance had done little to soften the predatory glint in his eyes, surveyed his guests with the satisfaction of a king reviewing his court. He was a large man, fond of tweed and pronouncements, and his laughter, when it came, was more a declaration of ownership than an expression of mirth. His wife, Beatrice, was his perfect counterpart. Elegant, attentive, her movements as fluid and controlled as the porcelain figurines on her mantelpiece. Yet if one looked closely, one might notice the faint, spidery lines of tension around her eyes, a sign that the burden of perfection was a heavy one to bear. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much, yet revealed too little. At the first table, Arthur was partnered with Elena Vance, a widow of considerable charm and, it was whispered, even more considerable inheritance. Elena played cards with the same theatrical flair she applied to life. Her every bid was a pronouncement, every card played a dramatic gesture. Her laughter was a shade too loud, her jewels a touch too brilliant, as if to distract from a certain hollowness within. Her opponents tonight were Dr. Alastair Finch and the newcomer, Silas Croft. Dr. Finch, the community's trusted physician, had been enveloped in a cloak of melancholy since the passing of his wife the previous year. He was a man of quiet intelligence, his hands long and delicate, his observations sharp but rarely spoken. Silas Croft, by contrast, was a man so thoroughly unremarkable as to be remarkable for that very reason. He had moved into the old Miller house 6 months prior, and had remained a pleasant enigma ever since, his past a closed book. At the second table, Beatrice had partnered with Penelope Sterling. Penelope was a creature of quiet corners and muted colours, an artist whose talents were perpetually overshadowed by the blinding ambition of her husband, Richard. She seemed to exist in a permanent state of apology, her voice seldom rising above a murmur. And opposite them sat Richard Sterling himself, partnered with his own reflection, for he was a man profoundly in love with his own success. A lawyer with a meteoric rise and a smile that could disarm a judge, Richard played bridge as he did everything else, with a ruthless, calculated aggression that left little room for chance or mercy. He was handsome, charming, and utterly detested by nearly everyone in the room, a fact of which he was blissfully, or perhaps deliberately, unaware. "Another hand to the Sterlings," Richard announced, his voice booming with a conqueror's pride as he swept up the trick. "Penelope, darling, you're playing with unusual fire tonight. To what do I owe this sudden surge of competence?" Penelope offered a wan smile, her eyes fixed on the cards in her hand. "Perhaps I'm simply tired of losing, Richard." Beatrice Hemlock watched them, her hostess smile unwavering. "A little competition is good for the soul. It keeps us all honest, does it not? One must always pay attention to such seemingly innocuous remarks, for in them the truth often seeks an escape. Keeps us honest, she had said. An interesting choice of words, given the circumstances that were about to unfold. The game continued, the storm outside intensifying its assault. The wind howled like a chorus of accusing ghosts, and the snow began to accumulate in thick, impassable drifts. Just as Arthur was dealing the final hand before supper, the lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the room into an abrupt and profound darkness. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by Elena Vance's theatrical shriek. "Heavens, Arthur, have you forgotten to pay the electric bill?" Arthur's voice, a reassuring baritone in the dark, cut through the nervous chatter. "It's the storm, my dear. The lines are likely down. Beatrice, the candles." Within moments, the soft, dancing light of a dozen candles filled the room, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. The faces of the guests, illuminated from below, seemed transformed into masks of suspicion and anxiety. The cosy familiarity of the evening had vanished, replaced by a primal, unsettling intimacy. It was then, in that flickering, uncertain light, that the first real tremor of discord was felt. "My drink," Richard Sterling's voice was sharp, cutting. "It tastes odd, bitter." Dr. Finch, ever the physician, spoke from the shadows. "Bitter, let me see." There was a scuffling sound, the clink of a glass, and then a terrible, guttural choking. It was a dreadful, inhuman sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the genteel evening. It was followed by the heavy, unmistakable thud of a body slumping from a chair onto the thick Persian rug. For a moment, there was only the sound of the raging blizzard and the frantic beating of 8 hearts. Dr. Finch was the first to move, his clinical instincts overriding his shock. He knelt beside the fallen form of Richard Sterling, his fingers searching for a pulse. The silence stretched into an eternity. When he finally looked up, his face was a pale, grim mask in the candlelight. "He's gone," Dr. Finch stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Richard Sterling is dead. Chapter II." The pronouncement fell into the room with the finality of a coffin lid shutting. Dead. It was a word that did not belong here, amidst the chintz curtains and polished silver. It was a vulgar, messy intrusion into a world built on decorum and unspoken agreements. Elena Vance let out a small, strangled sob, while her partner, Arthur Hemlock, stood as still as a statue, his face unreadable. His wife, Beatrice, moved with a strange, dreamlike calm, placing a comforting hand on Penelope Sterling's shoulder. Penelope, for her part, simply stared at her husband's body on the floor, her expression not one of grief, but of a profound and unnerving stillness. "We must call the police," Sealers Croft said, his voice surprisingly steady. He moved towards the telephone on the hall table, only to return a moment later, shaking his head. "The line is dead, as I suspected." "My mobile phone," Arthur grunted, fumbling in his jacket pocket. He held it up. "No signal." "We're cut off, completely." And there it was. The classic, inescapable trap. One that I, my dear reader, have always found to be most effective in concentrating the mind. The blizzard that had been a mere inconvenience was now a prison wall. The cosy drawing room had become a cage, and its occupants were trapped inside with a victim, and, one must logically conclude, a murderer. Dr. Finch had risen to his feet. "I would advise no one to touch anything," he said, his tone carrying a new authority. "Especially not the glass." He gestured to the crystal tumbler that had rolled under the card table. Given the suddenness of the attack and Richard's comment about the bitter taste, I would be willing to stake my professional reputation on the fact that this was not a natural death. This was poison. Poison. The word hung in the candlelit air, more chilling than the wind outside. It spoke of premeditation, of cold, calculated intent. This was not a crime of passion, but an execution. One must always consider the little grey cells, and the cells of a poisoner are a very particular shade of grey indeed. "Poison," Arthur Hemlock boomed, his composure finally cracking. "In my house, that's preposterous." "Is it, Arthur?" Dr. Finch's gaze was level. "Richard is dead. His drink was poisoned. The drink was served in this room. The poisoner, therefore, is almost certainly one of us." The accusation, though unspoken, implicated everyone. A current of fear and suspicion arced between them, visible as a flicker in their eyes. Each person looked at their neighbour, their friend of many years, and saw for the first time a potential killer. "We must be methodical," the doctor continued, taking charge. "We need to establish what happened. Beatrice, you served the drinks before the last hand, did you not?" Beatrice nodded, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Yes. I poured the cider for everyone from the pitcher on the sideboard. Richard was the only one drinking whiskey. I poured it for him myself. And did you leave the glass unattended?" "I brought it directly to him," she said, her voice a faint whisper. "He was sitting right there." "So," Alastair Finch mused, his eyes sweeping the room, "either the poison was in the decanter of whiskey, or it was added to Richard's glass after you served it. Did anyone approach the table while the hand was being played?" A flurry of denials and confused recollections followed. It was dark, a card game was in progress, no one had been paying attention. Ah, but someone always pays attention. It was Penelope who spoke, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Richard," he got up, just for a moment. He said he needed to stretch his legs. He walked over to the window to look at the snow. Her gaze drifted towards the heavy velvet curtains. Dr. Finch's eyes sharpened. "And his drink was on the table then?" "Yes," she confirmed, "on the small table beside his chair." For a full minute, the only sounds were the storm and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking another second of their shared captivity. This was the point, my dear reader, at which the delicate veneer of social grace begins to crack. The investigation, such as it was, had begun. The drawing room had become an interrogation chamber, and these longtime friends were now suspects, accuser and accused in one. Dr. Finch, with Sealers Croft's assistance, gently moved Richard's body to a small adjoining study, covering it with a cashmere throw from the sofa. It was a grim, necessary task that sobered them all. When they returned, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions. "Let us consider motive," Dr. Finch said, his voice low and clinical as he addressed the remaining 6 people, who had reason to wish Richard Sterling harm. The question was met with a defensive, stony silence. To admit to a motive was tantamount to a confession. "This is absurd, Alastair," Arthur Hemlock blustered. "We were all his friends." "Were we, Arthur?" Elena Vance's voice was surprisingly sharp. She had recovered her composure and now seemed to be relishing the drama. "You and he had that dreadful row over the property line just last month. I heard you tell him you'd see him ruined." Arthur's face flushed a dangerous shade of purple. "That was just talk, a figure of speech. We settled it amicably." "Did you?" Dr. Finch pressed gently. "I heard Richard was planning to file a lawsuit that would have cost you a considerable sum." Before Arthur could reply, Beatrice intervened, her voice like ice. "Arthur had no reason to harm Richard, but perhaps others did. Elena, you weren't exactly immune to Richard's charms, were you? And Penelope, his wife, suffered his indiscretions. A woman scorned, as they say." It was a masterful deflection, turning the spotlight onto the 2 women. Penelope flinched as if struck, while Elena drew herself up, indignant. "How dare you? Richard and I were merely friends." The web of connections, of simmering resentments and hidden animosities, was beginning to reveal itself. "I have always found that in a group of seemingly respectable people, there are enough secrets to fuel a dozen tragedies." The questioning continued, a slow, painful peeling away of layers. Dr. Finch, with his calm, logical approach, acted as the reluctant inquisitor. He established that no one had left the room since the drinks were served. He confirmed that his own medical bag, which he'd brought in from the cold, contained a variety of potent drugs, but he swore it had not been opened. Sealers Croft, when questioned, admitted to a past career as an industrial chemist before his retirement, a fact that cast a new, sinister light on his unassuming presence. Everyone, it seemed, had either a motive or the means. As the night wore on, the tension became unbearable. Alliances shifted, Suspicious glances were exchanged. The fire began to die down and a deep, penetrating cold seeped into the house. They were running out of time, of warmth, of civility. It was during a tense, whispered argument between Arthur and Beatrice, in the corner of the room, that Penelope Sterling, who had been sitting silently by the cold fireplace, finally stirred. She walked over to the card table where her husband had died. The cards from the final hand were still scattered there. With a delicate finger, she slid one card from underneath a fallen score pad. She held it up for the others to see in the dim candlelight. It was the Queen of Spades. "This was in his hand," she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time that night. "He was holding it when he fell, the Queen of Spades." The card of ill fortune, of death. The sight of the card, stark and symbolic, sent a fresh wave of dread through the room. It felt like a message, a signature, but the most curious clue was yet to come. As the others stared at the card, mesmerized, Dr. Finch, who had been examining the area around Richard's chair, let out a low exclamation. "What's this?" He knelt and picked something from the deep pile of the rug. It was a small, ornate button made of mother-of-pearl, shaped like a tiny flower. It was not from a man's shirt. "Does anyone recognize this?" he asked, holding it out on his palm. Silence. No one claimed it. Yet it had to belong to someone in the room. Another secret, another lie. The house of cards they had all so carefully constructed was beginning to collapse, one betrayal at a time. The game was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. Chapter III. The discovery of the mother-of-pearl button shifted the psychological landscape of the room. It was a tangible object, a piece of hard evidence in a swirling fog of conjecture and fear. It lay on Dr. Finch's palm, gleaming in the candlelight, a tiny, silent accuser. Every eye was drawn to it, and then, inevitably, to the attire of the three women in the room. Beatrice Hemlock was wearing a simple cashmere dress of deep burgundy, its buttons plain and functional. Elena Vance's black velvet ensemble was fastened with ostentatious jet clasps. Penelope Sterling's grey wool cardigan, however, was adorned with a row of small, delicate floral buttons. With a collective intake of breath, everyone looked at her cuffs. The third button on her right sleeve was missing. Penelope looked down at her wrist, a flicker of something. Was it surprise? Fear, crossing her face? I don't understand, it must have come off." "It must have indeed, Penelope," Arthur Hemlock said, his voice heavy with implication. "Perhaps when you were leaning over to administer something to your husband's drink." "No," she cried, shrinking back. "I would never, I loved him." "Ah, but my dear reader, love and hate are two sides of the same coin, and it is often a simple matter of a coin toss to see which one lands face up." Her denial was passionate, yet it rang hollow. Who among them truly believed she had loved the man who so publicly humiliated her? "Your husband was having an affair, was he not, Mrs. Sterling?" Dr. Finch's question was gentle, but it struck with the force of a physical blow. "With Elena Vance?" He did not look at Elena as he said it, but at Penelope. It was a classic interrogator's trick, to gauge the reaction of the wronged party. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of wounded innocence that was entirely unconvincing. "That is a monstrous lie," she declared. "Is it?" Penelope's voice was suddenly cold as steel. She turned her gaze to Elena, and for the first time, the mousy artist looked at the glamorous widow with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "I saw the letters, Elena, the ones you thought you'd hidden so cleverly. Richard was planning to leave me. He was going to take everything and leave me with nothing." The confession, wrung from her by the doctor's accusation, created a motive so powerful, so primal, that it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The grieving widow was transformed into the vengeful wife. The button on the floor was no longer just a clue, it was a noose tightening around her neck. Yet something felt amiss. It was all perhaps a little too neat. The scorned wife, the damning piece of evidence falling at her feet. One must always be wary of the obvious solution. The human mind is drawn to simplicity, but murder is rarely a simple affair. The group fragmented, retreating into suspicious pairs and lonely corners. The night deepened, the cold becoming a physical presence, a constant reminder of their isolation and peril. Arthur busied himself with the fire, jabbing at the dying embers with a ferocity that spoke of his frayed nerves. He and Beatrice exchanged tense, whispered words, their united front as hosts now shattered. Silas Croft, the quiet observer, watched everyone from his chair, his face a neutral mask that revealed nothing and saw everything. It was during this lull that Dr. Finch, unable to rest, decided to perform a more thorough, albeit rudimentary, examination of the scene. With a candle in hand, he returned to the corner where Richard had fallen. He ran his fingers over the carpet, peered under the furniture. "What are you looking for, Doctor?" Silas Croft asked, having followed him quietly. "I'm not entirely sure," Alastair admitted. A dropped vial, a packet of powder, anything out of place. The poisoner had to get the substance into the glass. That is the one indisputable fact. The question is how and when. He paused, frowning. "What strikes me as odd is the delivery method." Richard complained of a bitter taste. Many poisons, particularly cyanides, have a distinct taste and smell, often described as bitter almonds, but to be so immediately noticeable. "It would suggest a large dose," Silas Croft finished, his knowledge of chemistry suddenly resurfacing. "Administered all at once, not something that was dissolved in the whiskey decanter beforehand." "Precisely," Dr. Finch agreed. Which brings us back to the moments after Beatrice served the drink. His eyes scanned the small table next to Richard's empty chair. On it was the whiskey glass, the score pad Penelope had moved, and a small silver dish of sugared almonds. A sudden, terrible stillness came over Dr. Finch. He leaned closer, his medical instincts overriding his caution. He sniffed the air directly above the dish of almonds, and then he recoiled, his face pale. "My God," he whispered. "The smell, it's faint, but it's there. Almonds." The two men looked at each other, the same horrifying conclusion dawning on them. The poison was not in the drink. It had been introduced to the drink. "A single poisoned almond," Silas Croft murmured, his voice laced with a mixture of horror and intellectual fascination. "Dropped into the whiskey, it would dissolve, releasing the cyanide. Simple, elegant, and utterly diabolical." This changed everything. The focus shifted from a liquid poison to a solid one, and it raised a new urgent question: who had access to the almonds? "Beatrice," Dr. Finch called out, his voice sharp. "These sugared almonds. Where did they come from?" Beatrice, startled from her tense conversation with Arthur, looked over. "From the pantry, of course. I put them out this afternoon." "Why? Did anyone else go near that dish, before the game, during a break?" A new round of denials, but the seed of a new theory had been planted. The button seemed less significant now, a potential red herring designed to frame the distraught wife. The real clue was the faint, deadly scent lingering in a silver dish. The hours crept by. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every creak of the old house was a footstep in the dark. The facade of friendship had been stripped away completely, revealing the raw, ugly truths beneath. The financial ruin Arthur faced because of Richard's legal machinations. The blackmail Richard held over Alina for a youthful indiscretion. She'd confessed to him in a moment of weakness. The professional disgrace Dr. Finch's late wife had suffered due to Richard's callous legal advice in a malpractice suit. Everyone, it turned out, had a secret. Everyone had a reason to want Richard Sterling dead. As dawn approached, a grey, spectral light began to filter through the windows, illuminating the snow-choked landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. But the silence inside the house was heavier, more oppressive. It was broken by a sudden, sharp cry from the hallway. They rushed out to find Beatrice Hemlock standing at the bottom of the main staircase, her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She was pointing at the small study where they had laid Richard's body. The door was ajar. Dr. Finch pushed past her and entered the room. A moment later he re-emerged, his face grim. "He's gone," he said, his voice flat with disbelief. "Gone," Arthur sputtered. What do you mean gone? A body can't just get up and walk away. The window, Dr. Finch said, pointing into the room. It's been forced open, and there are tracks in the snow outside. They stared at him, uncomprehending. The impossible had happened. In a house sealed by a blizzard, with a murderer among them, the victim's body had vanished into the frozen dawn. The betrayed bridge party had taken another turn, spiralling from a simple murder into a baroque and terrifying puzzle. The little grey cells strained against a mystery that grew deeper and darker with every passing hour. Chapter IV. The disappearance of the body was an act of such audacious lunacy that it momentarily stunned the occupants of the house into a state of collective shock. Murder was one thing. It was a crime driven by human passions, greed, revenge, jealousy. But this was something else. It was an act of calculated madness, a deliberate move to sow chaos and confusion. The tracks lead towards the woods at the back of the property, Arthur Hemlock reported, returning from a brief and frigid inspection at the open study window. He was shivering, though whether from the cold or from fear was difficult to say. Whoever it was had a considerable head start. They're lost in the snow by now. But who would do such a thing, and why? Elena Vance's voice was a hysterical whisper. It's ghoulish. The why is rather obvious, my dear, Dr. Finch observed, his mind already working through the possibilities. A body is the most crucial piece of evidence in a murder investigation. Without a body, there can be no autopsy. The presence of poison cannot be definitively proven. Our killer, it seems, is not only clever but also desperate. The implication was terrifying. The murderer was not content to sit and wait for the snow to melt and the police to arrive. They were still active, still thinking, still working to cover their tracks. And they had been awake, moving through the darkened house while the others sat paralyzed by fear. Someone dragged a dead man out of this house and into a snowstorm, Penelope said, her voice trembling. It would have taken a great deal of strength. The suspicion in the room immediately shifted towards the two strongest men, Arthur Hemlock and Silas Croft. Arthur, with his large, powerful frame, and Silas, whose quiet demeanor might well conceal a hidden reserve of physical prowess. This is insane, Arthur roared, rounding on his wife. Did you hear anything, Beatrice? You were upstairs, were you not? I was in our bedroom trying to rest, she replied, her face pale. I heard nothing but the wind. Her eyes, however, darted nervously towards the staircase, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. A lie, or just terror? The search for clues resumed with a new, frantic energy. It was Silas Croft who made the next discovery. In the study, near the open window, half hidden under the edge of the carpet, was a small, sodden piece of paper. It was a bridge scoring slip, identical to the ones they had been using. It had clearly been dropped by the person who had moved the body. On it, instead of scores, a single word was scrawled in faint, spidery handwriting: atonement, atonement. For what? For the murder, or for some older, deeper sin? The word suggested a motive that went beyond simple revenge. It spoke of guilt, of a moral debt being paid. As the morning light grew stronger, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a sense of finality began to settle over the group. The game was reaching its endgame. The clues were all on the table, scattered and confusing though they were. A poisoned almond, a missing button, a playing card, a vanished body, and a cryptic note. All that was needed was a mind capable of assembling them into a coherent whole. And it was, surprisingly, Penelope Sterling who began to see the pattern. She had been the quietest, the most overlooked player in this deadly game. But, my dear reader, it is often the one we overlook who sees the most clearly. She had been observing, listening, her artist's eye taking in details others had missed. She walked to the center of the room, her presence suddenly commanding. It doesn't make sense, she began, her voice low but clear. Nothing fits together. The button points to me, but I didn't do it. The strength needed to move the body points to the men, but the note, atonement, that feels like the language of a guilty conscience, not a panicked killer covering their tracks. She looked around the room, her gaze resting on each person in turn. We have been looking at this as one crime, but what if it is two? What if the person who moved the body is not the person who committed the murder? The idea was startling, yet it had a strange logic to it. Penelope continued, her reasoning gaining momentum. The Queen of Spades, Richard was holding it. But why was it placed in his hand? Or was he trying to tell us something with his last ounce of strength? A queen, a powerful woman. Her eyes flicked towards Beatrice Hemlock. And the button, she went on, turning to Dr. Finch. You found it on the floor, Doctor, but my cardigan wasn't torn, the thread is intact. The button wasn't ripped off in a struggle, it would have had to have been unscrewed. The buttons on this cardigan are attached with a small screw fitting on the back. It would take time, it was planted. She walked over to Beatrice, whose face had become a porcelain mask of composure. You were the hostess, Mrs. Hemlock. You served the almonds. You were the one who moved about the room while we were playing. You could have planted my button. You could have poisoned the almonds in your own pantry. You were standing right behind Richard's chair when he got up to look at the snow. This is a desperate, absurd accusation, Arthur blustered, stepping in front of his wife. Is it? Penelope's voice did not waver. There is one more clue, one that everyone has missed. When the lights went out, Mrs. Hemlock, you were the calmest of all. You knew exactly where the candles were. And when you lit the first one, I saw something, just for a second. On your hand, a smudge of dirt, like garden soil. Odd for a woman with perfectly manicured hands in the middle of a bridge party. Dr. Finch's eyes widened in realization. The poison, cyanide, it's found in some pesticides. In a garden shed, perhaps. The net was closing, every piece was falling into place, but the motive was still missing. Why would Beatrice Hemlock, the perfect hostess, murder her guest in such a brutal fashion? Beatrice looked at Penelope, and the mask finally cracked. A look of profound, soul-deep weariness replaced her careful composure. She slowly raised a hand and touched the string of pearls at her throat. He was my son, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it resounded through the silent room like a gunshot. Chapter V. The confession, when it came, was not a torrent but a quiet, steady stream of sorrow. Arthur Hemlock looked at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. I was very young, Beatrice began, her eyes fixed on some distant point in her past. From a family with no name and no money. I had a child out of wedlock. To save me from disgrace, my family arranged for a quiet adoption. I never saw him again. I went on, I met Arthur, I built this life, this perfect, beautiful life. Her gaze swept the room, the symbol of all she had fought to protect. And then, a year ago, a lawyer came to town, Richard Sterling. He had been looking for his birth mother. He found me. A collective gasp went through the room. The monstrous, arrogant Richard was the son Beatrice had abandoned decades ago. At first I thought it was a miracle, she continued, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. But he didn't want a mother. He wanted leverage. He saw Arthur's wealth, our position, and he became a predator. He learned of Arthur's financial troubles, the ones he caused, and he used his knowledge to make them worse. He threatened to expose me, to ruin Arthur, to destroy everything I had built. He was my son, my own flesh and blood, and he was a poison in my life. The word hung in the air. Poison. Tonight, she said, her voice gaining a chilling strength, he told me his final demand. He wanted to be named Arthur's sole heir, disinheriting Arthur's own children. He said if I refused, he would tell everyone at the party tonight who I was, who he was. He would burn my world to the ground. And so I went to the garden shed where I keep the pesticides for the roses. I chose one almond from the dish, just one, and I made it perfect for him. It was a crime born not of greed or jealousy, but of a desperate, twisted act of preservation. She had killed her own son to protect the life she had chosen over him. The betrayal of the title was hers. But I didn't move the body, she said, looking directly at Dr. Finch. I would have let the police come, I would have faced justice. All eyes turned to the doctor. He looked down at his hands, a deep sigh escaping him. The note, he said quietly. Atonement, that was mine. He looked up, his face etched with a profound guilt. My wife, before she died, her reputation was destroyed by that malpractice suit. Richard Sterling was the opposing counsel. He was ruthless, cruel. He destroyed her. Her spirit died long before her body gave out. I have lived with that failure, that inability to protect her every day since. Tonight, when I realized what Beatrice had done, I saw it as a form of justice. A terrible one, but justice nonetheless. I couldn't let her be discovered because of my diagnosis of poison. So when everyone was distracted, I removed the evidence. I carried him out into the snow. It was my penance, my atonement for failing my own wife. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Two separate acts born from two separate agonies, intertwined in one tragic night. A murderess and her unwitting accomplice. As if on cue, a low, grinding rumble could be heard in the distance. The snowplows. The sound of the outside world, of order and consequence, breaking through their isolation. Their time was up. There was nothing more to be said. The long night was over. The secrets of the betrayed bridge party lay exposed in the cold morning light. Justice of a kind had been done, but its scales were hopelessly unbalanced, weighed down by the sorrows and sins of the past. As the sound of the plough grew louder, a final, unspoken understanding passed between the survivors. They would carry the ghosts of this night forever, a permanent addition to their quiet, respectable lives. The game was over, and no one had won.